welcome to the very first episode of Talking Cars. I'm Steve Ottley, editor-at-large of TalkCafe.com, and I'm joined by my longtime friend and fellow longtime motoring journalist, Scott Newman. Hey, Scott.
G'day, Steve.
So, if you've picked up any car magazine in Australia in the last, say, 15 years, chances are Scott's stories will have been in front of you. He has been writing about cars and shredding tyres for the likes of Wheels, Motor, Unique Cars and Car Sales for years, and has a well-deserved reputation as one of Australia's most astute performance car road testers. And he's also a passionate petrolhead like me, but hopefully we won't agree all the time because that will make for a pretty boring podcast. Anyway, thanks for joining me, Scott. Glad to have you along for the ride.
No worries. It is a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Okay, now there are no shortages of podcasts on the in the world today, so you shouldn't really need an explanation on how it works, but here's the plan for this specific podcast. Frankly, Scott and I just love talking about cars. So the plan each week is we're going to pick a topic and we're going to pick our top 5. And we're going to go through our personal top 5 lists and we're going to count down from 5 to 1 and hopefully discuss the merit of each other's different choices. Like I say, it's going to be pretty boring if we just keep picking the same cars. But I'm sure that will happen from time to time. But before we do that, let's tell you about what's making news on TalkCafe.com. And I guess the question for this week, Scott, is have we reached peak ute? I've just gotten back from driving the new MG U9. So far this year, we've had some other big name arrivals like the LDV Terra 9, the Kia Tasman, of course, and the BYD Shark 6. So do we have too many utes?
I think we're getting close to market saturation because we've got all these new players. For so many years, it was Navara, it was Triton, it was Hilux, it was Ranger. A couple around the fringes, maybe lowered it, but now, maybe 5 years ago, we got the next influx with the like of GWM and LDV. And now, suddenly, the floodgates have opened with the MG U9 and the Kia Tasman, and more are coming, new Photons coming back, stuff like that. So, but I think we are seeing, in terms of overall peak capacity, peak volume, we're probably at peak ute. I don't think we're going to see maybe another 10, 20% increase in ute sales, especially with NVES coming in. But I think we're also splitting the segment, which I'll get your input on because you've driven some of the newer ones, between this lifestyle ute versus your tradie ute. So you've got your sort of MG U9s and your BYD Sharks, and then you've got your Hiluxes and your Rangers, stuff like that. So we're maybe seeing a bit more fragmentation.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting. I mean, even going back to the start of this year, Sean Hanley from Toyota, he's really been setting that foundation for Hilux and potentially Ranger to get overtaken by the likes of, like, say, Toyota RAV4 as we see more people just, again, keep flocking to SUVs. But you're right, the market has fragmented and we've gotten to this point where I think, if you look at the sales, Ranger and Hilux are now so far ahead of everything else. They're kind of in a league of their own. They are the default tradies choice. But also there is an increasing amount of them that are becoming, like you said, lifestyle utes. MG makes no secret. That's got a multi-link rear end. It's got stitched leaf springs. It's sacrificed a bit of payload to be a bit more, SUV like. I mean, the Tasman, for all of its payload capabilities and all those, they have really tried to make it a working ute. It looks like an SUV inside. We are seeing this transition away from the utes as we've known them to something, far more livable and practical on a day-to-day basis rather than necessarily practical for the work site. So it's going to be interesting to watch and see how it goes.
Absolutely. The other thing will be how the powertrains evolve. As will diesel continue to dominate? Will things like the Shark take over? Because I've been surprised, like even after the tax advantages ended for PHEVs, Shark sales are still continued, which I think most people thought they'd fall off. So it's going to be a very interesting time in next 3 or 5 years to see how that evolves.
Yeah, for sure. Like you say, with NVES, the vehicle efficiency standard, it's going to be interesting to see. Like, I think, to be blunt, looking at the sales, I think the Ford Ranger PHEV has been had a slow start. It'll be interesting to see how that goes up. But by no means, I think it's too early to say it's not worked. It's obviously got off to a much slower start than say the Shark has. But certainly, I think it's going to be interesting to watch plug-in hybrids, because I think it's pretty transparent. You look at, say, like the US market, and you see how the electric, Ford F-150 and Chevrolet Silverado have frankly not performed, and even the Cybertruck, Tesla Cybertruck has been a flop. People do not want electric utes, so there's going to be a change in some ways forced upon the market by government, but consumers are still going to want to buy their big utes, and so there's going to have to be some sort of compromise somewhere along the way. But anyway, it's interesting. It's interesting times. Now, you can read my MGU9 review on talkcafe.com and get all the latest news and reviews there. But moving on to the main event, our topic for this week, our top 5 topic is we've gone with a classic Australian theme for our very first episode, the top 5 best Holdens. Now, this, obviously, this is a highly emotive and a very broad subject. So the brief I gave to Scott and myself was pretty simple. Imagine that the World Institute of Cars, which is obviously a completely made-up thing...
We should start that, though.
Yeah, potentially, yeah, maybe, if we can... just need a building. And, I think it's... Maybe just let's copyright that name before we go too far. Yep. But, pretty simple. Imagine that they are hosting an exhibition on Holden. What are the 5 cars we would send to represent the brand? So this is strictly Holdens. And, so we're skipping the HSVs and HDTs and those sorts of things. So hopefully that's a list for another day. So the 5 Holdens that really define the brand. So, Scott, kick us off. What is your number 5?
Okay, so just a quick note on how I approached this. I wanted to have my 5-car museum exhibit, and I wanted to have a broad church that sort of covered everything Holden did, the whole history of Holden. So I've got a variety of variants and eras. So I'm just kicking it off with the HQ 1-tonner, because you got to have a ute in there. It's so quintessentially Australian, the ute, even though obviously Ford kind of started the whole pickup ute thing. You got to have a Holden ute in there. The HQ was still, obviously later they became sort of sports utes. They were still usable, but they didn't have the capacity in terms of payload, whereas an HQ, as the name suggests, it was a 1-tonner. You could carry a heap of stuff on it. And the HQ was the biggest selling Australian car of all time. The HQ range went all the way from like a ute all the way to a Premier, to a Statesman, to a Monaro. So that represents the HQ, which I think is a very important part of the Holden's history. Yeah. And it represents the ute.
Yeah, it's a great choice. I mean, when I started, going to car races, the HQ series was a staple, because there was just so many of them around. They were a cheap, easy car. It's effectively the Toyota 86 series of the 80s and 90s was racing HQs.
That series thinned the ranks pretty quickly, though.
there was a fair bit of panel damage. All right.
What do you got?
My number 5, similar kind of vein, I went with the Sandman. Cool. Classic 70s. If we're talking about Holden and its cultural impact, obviously not the huge volume that, like say, HQ did, but the cultural impact that I think Sandman had on Australia. It was very much of the time. It came out in the 70s. It had that sort of surfing, camping, dare I say, 1970s sexual revolution kind of vibe. You look at the official press photos back in the day even had, what appear to be naked people in the back of it. So there was really no there was no sort of questioning what the car's purpose was.
That would have been an interesting press launch.
Yeah. Yeah, probably back in the day they probably were a bit different. They're a bit more tame now. Yeah. But
cool.
Yeah, I mean, this obviously, the panel van was just a like I say, it's become sort of part of the Australian automotive DNA, and so you see it, they brought it back later on as a in tribute, and even Triple Eight built the Sandman supercar, which is sort of just again it sort of shows you how what a lasting impact Sandman had, even though it was really only around for a brief time.
Yeah, I mean that's a great pick, and one I didn't even think of. So that's the beauty of these lists. So and again, given the volumes, definitely an oversized cultural impact.
Yeah. Okay, number 4. What do you got?
Okay, number 4, I've got the VN Calais.
All right.
So, and I'm gonna give a shout out to the VN. I thought about putting a VT here because the VT was extremely popular, but the VN often gets overshadowed. People, I think, concentrate on the VB being the first Commodore, going down a size, or the VT because it was spectacularly popular and just demolished the AU. But the VN I include for a few reasons. One, it was much more successful than VB to VL. Like a VL Calais might have been, it probably was a better car than a VN Calais, to be honest. Lovely RB30, but you can't have a Japanese engine in a car that's representing Australia on the world stage. So the VN, after years of being beaten, overtook the Falcon to become Australia's best-selling car. So that was a massive thing, because for years, while private buyers loved the VB to VL, fleets didn't, so they needed to go to a bigger car. It felt, and it sort of set the template, I think, for the next, well, until the Commodore ended, really, of having a GM engine. It came with GM support. It had great performance because it was really, really light and had this new 3.8 litre V6 in it that gave it heaps of grunt. It was the fastest sort of base Commodore for a while. So while the VN, why you wouldn't maybe put it as one of the best Holdens, because it had its flaws, still narrow tracked and stuff like that, I think it was a very important car for turning Holden's fortunes around and making it successful, because Holden had just been bailed out by GM, so it was really on the rope, so it really needed something to work, and it did. It created this car with not much money, but it hit the nail on the head, overtook the Falcon, and I've chosen the Calais because the VN also introduced the first Commodore Ute and the first sort of Commodore-based fancy cars, Statesman and Caprice. So that's why it gets my number 4.
Okay. No, I love it. I think it's a great choice. Like, it's easy to overlook, just how successful those cars were. They were the default choice for, we now live in this era of SUVs and utes, like we're talking about, but for decades, when we were growing up, that was the default choice for families, and so the VN certainly played a huge role in my childhood and adolescence. Growing up, they were just everywhere. They were ubiquitous. So
100%.
Yeah. No, I went a little bit different for my number 4. I went back to the beginning, the 48215 FX. There is no Holden without it, right? It was the beginning. Obviously, it had a fair degree of Chevrolet input because it was a GM product, but it became quintessentially Australian. It was rolled out in 48. By 51, they'd done a Ute version of it. So that generation, I think, laid the foundations for Holden. For the next 50 odd years, it sort of said, look, this is a car that's built for Australian conditions. It's going to be built in Australia, and I think. We overlook, obviously, probably not Holden's finest car in the grand scheme of things, and it's not as big a seller or any of that sort of stuff. But I think without it, it's hard to tell the story of Holden.
100%. Yep, very, very important car. Yeah, 48215, and then it was originally called the Holden, I think.
Yeah. It's in some ways a little bit. It's the Australian version of the LaFerrari.
That's right. Yeah,
it's just the Holden. So it's sort of an appropriate name for it because it really is. Like I say, without it, it's hard to imagine without it being a set. Imagine if it was a flop. If people have been trying to build cars in Australia for a long time, and if it had been a terrible thing, then customers just wouldn't have bought it, and we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation because there'd only be one Holden to talk about.
That's right. I think a lot of people forget that Australia built cars for a long time, and Holden built cars for a long time. Obviously, other manufacturers, like CKD kits, what are they? Complete knockdown kits.
Yeah.
So there was a long history of car building in Australia, but not that sort of start to finish manufacturing thing. That's why the 48215 was so important. It was truly an Australian car. Yeah,
and look, slight personal detour here. My my great-grandfather was involved in a project in the 1920s and 30s in a car called the Australian Six, which was, again, an attempt to build a car here. And yes, it was largely, I think, Chevrolet parts, but, they tried to build it in Sydney. But it became apparent, relatively quickly, it's cheaper to import them. And unfortunately, we've come back to that now as a country, but and that's a much longer conversation.
Yeah, it's a conversation for another day. Yep.
Yeah, but I think it underlines like the success of the 48215 underlines that it worked as a car, but it also worked as a business. And that was really the important to establish Holden as a business and make it work in Australia. So, yeah, I think it's deserves its place in Holden immortality. So anyway, what about you? What's number 3 on your list?
So first step on the podium for me is the HT Monaro GDS 350.
Okay.
The Monaro, you've got to have a Monaro in there, I think, and I picked that one because it's still got the Bathurst heritage. It won Bathurst, which the HG didn't. Was apparently, I haven't driven one, but apparently the HG is a bit nicer to drive than the HK, the original 327. If you look at a Holden showroom from 67 to 68, like in 67 you had the HR series, right? Boxy, kind of small, pretty weedy 6, and then in the space of 12 months, suddenly you had this amazing looking 2-door V8 power, went to Bathurst, won Bathurst. It was such an important car. And you mentioned about the Sandman typifying that era. And I think that Monaro does that with the sort of the swinging 60s. Suddenly the press material had people in nice clothes and bright colours, and really it was Holden, I think, becoming a really serious car manufacturer in that suddenly it had sporty models and desirable models. And the Bathurst cars get all the halo, but you could get like a 186 3 on the tree Monaro if you just wanted the look and you didn't care about the speed. And like the number of engines and options they had, it's amazing back then. But that's why the Monaro has to be. And I mean, it was such a success that they brought it back with other great success in the early 2000s. So
yeah. Well, for reasons that will become obvious soon, I do certainly agree with you on a lot of those points.
Okay.
No, I think it's interesting. I have got it on my list. I got the HK on my list at number 2.
Yep.
So I guess we can talk about that now. The reality is, look, I went with HK because it was the first, but I agree with all those points you say. Like the reality is, as much as say the 48215 kind of set the agenda as and established this business. The Monaro was really that car, and obviously there was a lot of the sedan was like we're talking about, it was a popular family choice at the time. The Monaro wasn't the sensible choice per se. It was showing that Holden was going to push the limits. It was going to be a stylish, desirable brand, and so by doing that and doing it with all those original Monaros, it kind of it set a tone and in many ways established the Australian car culture.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it was the I guess it was the first Aussie halo car, really. Like again, you say you might have wanted a Monaro 327, but you'd go and get a Belmont or something like a 4-door, but it took you to a Holden showroom, and obviously the other reason that car's so important is that it took Ford 4 years to get an XA coupe together, and Valiant about the same. So they were really leading the charge in terms of that V8 muscle car coupe thing. Yeah,
like the V8 muscle car as we know it kind of is spawn of this generation. These HK Monaro. Obviously the win in Bathurst kind of helps set that legendary status, and so it really did. This is why I had it at number 2, is because I think it really defined Australian car culture for decades. I mean, we still look at it, we still love V8s, right? Like you and I, if they said, we're going to bring, going to have a Holden V8 tomorrow, we'd love it. Like it's just a part of our ingrained DNA as fans of it. Like to be honest, I didn't grow up in a Ford or a Holden household, like that, like so many people did. for whatever reason, my dad had Mitsubishis. We had the other Australian-made car, the Magna. But it was still part of it, right? Like it was still one of those things where, you know, the V8 Holden was a special car. You know, by the time we were kids, the Monaro wasn't around until it made its sort of short-lived comeback. But, you know, the fact of the matter was, it set the tone for the next, you know, for decades, and not even decades. I mean, it's like I say, still now. You know, we see how much Australian consumers love V8s. So, and I think a lot of it comes from that. So, yeah, it's hard to imagine Holden without a Monaro. That's for damn sure. Even though they didn't have one for decades, you know, it's interesting. It's fascinating to see when they brought back the coupe concept. You know, I still remember seeing that at the 98 Sydney Motor Show, and it was just stunning. Like it was just amazing, and like stunning in the sense that it was visually a fantastic looking car. But also the fact that, like, here's Holden just pulling out all the stops and making something really special.
Yeah, the impact, the size of the cultural impact the original car had was verified by the reaction when they brought it back. When they brought it back and the production car came out in, 2001, I think it was?
Yeah.
Like, it was the hottest thing around. Like, you could drive a Lambo or a Ferrari down the street and no one would care because they were looking at a Monaro. So, and I was part of that. Like when you saw it, you're like, whoa, those beautiful colours. So, but what was your number 3? Because you've got to do number 3.
Okay, we'll backtrack slightly to number 3. And look, it's hard to narrow it down to a specific model. But in a similar vein to the Monaro, I would love to. You know, I've got to pick a Tirana. You know, if you're talking the ultimate Tirana, to me, obviously, it's the A9X. That was, truly an iconic car. It said so much about that kind of, as much as sort of the Commodore and the HQ were the family cars of the 70s and 80s, and then Commodore obviously into the 90s. You know, the Tirana, I think, was the hero model of the 70s in so many respects. It was the race car. It was winning Bathurst with Brock and that sort of stuff. But even going back to going back originally to Brock in the 72 with the XU1, like a 6-cylinder car, it demonstrated handling. In some ways, it was the car that showed, hey, Australia, we need to, V8s are great, but we also need to do handling. And so, and that, then we saw that roll on into the future. And that's what we we ultimately ended up with these fantastic handling V8s, and so you got the best of both worlds. But I think it's, again, hard to imagine Holden without the Tirana. It's a shame it sort of disappeared when it did, and it would have been great to have seen it come back, and maybe in some ways that was what Holden was missing towards the end, was sort of a small car that was affordable and could appeal to people. We saw them try and bring it back with TT36 as a concept and that sort of thing, but again, partly sort of ingrained in our culture. But it's just, again, hard to think of Holden without thinking of Tirana.
Yeah, there's no argument there. I mean, it's another iconic brand, and it is interesting though that the Tirana nameplate is so different, because it's on the LC and the LJ, which are quite different cars from the LH, LX, and even the UC. So it does span quite a broad remit, but I mean, A9X is just so cool, and if there was just so easily modified as well. The road car wasn't anything necessarily special, but it was a pure homologation special. It was there just to homologate the car to go racing, and you got to love it for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the part of that cool thing about that era, and it's, I guess, part of it why I chose it is, like I say, there's plenty of Tiranas, and in some ways the bread and butter Tiranas, like you say, they were probably just as important in the grand scheme of things for Holden, but there is just something about the A9X as, it's just the definitive Tirana. If you say, close your eyes, think of a Tirana, that's the one that's going to come to my head straight away. So, there's
a story. Actually, I've got a quick story. I did a feature many, many, many years ago with Unique Cars, and the Bowdens brought along some of their cars. And who was it? I can't remember. Which one of the Bowdens? Might have been Chris. He gave me a ride around Lakeside in the car, in the 78 HDT car. I was just sitting on the floor because I only had one seat. He wasn't going that fast or anything like that, but we had to get back to the pit, so I just jumped in it and sat on the floor. So I've done a lap of Lakeside on the floor of the 1978 HDT car, and it still went pretty damn hard. And just to be in that car is just super, super cool.
Yeah, well, not jealous at all.
That's fine.
Sounds terrible. Okay, well, that's my number 3. What about your number 2?
Number 2, drum roll, is the... Yes. I've gone very specific here. Holden VF2 Motorsport Edition.
Okay.
A car I never get to drive, sadly, but I drove heaps of red lines and stuff like that. But I picked this car for quite a few reasons. VE was super important. Like, that was Holden showing off, probably Holden at its most powerful. Biggest budget. It had a big export program that didn't work because of GFC. We all most people know the story. But the reason I picked the VF is because, it showed Holden improved until the very end. Like, there was no reason for that car to come out at the very end with the involvement. If you didn't know, the Motorsport Edition basically took an SS red line, which is already a really, really good package. Gave the adaptive dampers, the magnetic ride control from the HSVs or the US Pontiacs, Chevy SS, got extra cooling on it, got extra chassis development, and it only came out like 12 months before the end. It was a limited run program. So that didn't really sort of make sense, but it showed that the engineers and the people behind Holden wanted to keep going and make the very best product until the very, very end in terms of that locally grown product. It showed that it was the best Commodore ever. It was just the best Commodore ever. I remember, like, VSS came out, great car, great touring car, great handling car for its time. Then the Redline package came out, extra performance again, and they just kept getting better and better and better until we got to that VF2 Redline that sort of sounded awesome when it got the LS3. And then, the Motorsport Edition, and obviously they brought back, we talk about famous names coming back, they brought back the Director, and what was the Ute called? Magnum.
Yeah.
That's right. So, but...
I mean, the Director was an interesting choice.
Yeah, the Director was...
that was a really interesting... I don't know if that's... I mean, it's very self-referential. It's very... In some ways, I don't know if it was too soon.
Yeah.
For a lot of people. Like, I mean, it is... I don't know if that was them having fun with it or what, but certainly as name choices go for a Holden, that was just kind of the most outrageous, given everything that happened with Brock and the Director back in the 80s. I think it was such a strange choice.
Yeah, it was a very weird era to bring back, given, like we talked about Sandman and Monaro, the joy of those nameplates.
Yeah. It's
like bringing back, the worst part of your life to to celebrate.
Like no one wants to relive the hardest memories typically, right?
There are certain names you wouldn't name your children.
Yeah,
probably guess what they are.
And and also it didn't have a polarizer in it, so it wasn't really a true Director. So exactly. I mean, like, what a cop out.
Exactly, but
just ridiculous.
I reckon, we've got a couple of classics in there. So, and those last Holdens were so good. They were such great cars that I think one of those needs to be there. So, I'm sticking a VT2 Motorsport Edition in my exhibit.
Okay. Now,
now we just got to deal with your number 1.
Well, it's funny you should say that because obviously we've skipped over... Well, we've touched on my number 2 already. Yeah. But so, conveniently... And we haven't set this up, folks. My number 1 is the Holden Commodore VF, the final Commodore.
Yep.
Because I did, like you said, SSV Redline, fantastic car. Genuinely, it was a world-class car. Yep. I mean, I've driven lots of cars. I would put that up against... I remember driving a particular European-branded, supposedly sports sedan, an Italian one, very fancy. And thinking, wow, a V6 Calais would leave this car for dead on a winding road. It had a V8 in it, this Italian thing. And it's just like thinking, this is a dud. Like, I mean, compared to the VF that was like just custom made for Australian conditions. It rode so well, but it had so much dynamic handling for a big car. The V6 was a good engine, but the V8 was a fantastic engine. Like I say, SSV Redline with all the stuff they put in. Like you say, they just kept improving, They just kept always working to make it better. And obviously, they didn't know at the time it was going to be the last one. But by that point, that sort of fine-tuned it, right? We'd had that real boom period of the early 2000s where we had, every variant known to man. Like the Monaro comes back, with the Crewman, remember the Crewman and the four-wheel drive. I mean, you talk about cars like you talk about, cars that attracted attention. I remember I took a Crewman to Bathurst, and
oh my God,
honestly, if I'd had a convertible Lamborghini with naked women throwing money out the back, I don't think I would have got any more looks or more attention. Like it was the singular most looked at car I think I've ever driven at the time. But I think, getting back to it, the VF, I personally have a lot of fond memories of the car. I was lucky enough to drive halfway around Australia in it. I drove one from a Calais V from Darwin to Sydney, all the way around the coast effectively. So we hugged the coast all the way up across to the north of Queensland and came down the coast. And it was just, genuinely one of my favourite memories of my professional career, shout out to our mutual friend Sam Charwood, who was my co-driver for that trip. We spent 9 days. I mean, just driving through the outback. I have a photo somewhere of this Calais in front of the Devil's Marbles in the middle of the NT, and it's just like quintessentially Australian landscape with the quintessential Australian car. And I think it was such a shame. And I think a big part of the reason why Holden ultimately failed was because they brought in, the ZB being an Opel. You just couldn't do it, right? No. Like, you can't pretend it's something it's not. Don't serve me tofu and tell me it's steak, right? Like it's, if you tell me it's tofu, I might eat it. But if you just you're trying to pretend it's something it's not, that's, it just didn't work because it was so inferior to what came before it. It wasn't a bad car, the ZB Commodore, by any stretch, but it was not a Commodore.
No.
I think Holden, again, in those final years, I think in some ways lost track of who they were. And I remember the argument at the time was, the original Commodore was an Opel, and so it's sort of coming back. It's like, well, no, but that's not really what the original Commodore was still built here, and it was modified, and it was changed, and it became something different, and that was the ultimate evolution. That's everything. That VF had everything, like we've talked about. From the 48215 onwards. They evolved everything. The lessons learnt on Tirana, the lessons learnt on Monaro. Even the cultural impact of Sandman. All those sorts of things all added up to make this, truly fantastic car. And it's such a shame that we lost it. But I feel incredibly grateful that I got to spend so much time driving it and driving the variants of it, because it was truly a fantastic car.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sometimes think about it now that when I first started my career, the first 6-7 years, all the way through, or certainly the motor years, like you'd be at Holden, you'd be at Port Melbourne picking up a Commodore every second week. Like the car calendar was full of them. You just drove them all the time, and then they just went. It just stopped. It left such a massive hole. And that's the thing. The weeks you weren't driving Commodores, you were probably driving Falcons.
Yeah.
And even I think now it's almost really hitting home. Now we're almost a decade on, the hole that it's left in Australian culture and Australian economics and Australian industry and all that sort of stuff. But without getting too serious on that sort of stuff, it was the culmination of everything the company had learned over 70 years about making cars, and they'd done. And like I say, all the variants were great. The Utes were awesome. The SSVs got the headlines because they had the most. But the Caprice, comfy, so much space. The Calais were great. You could drive them on a dirt road. And then it's interesting to sort of go full circle now that Rob Tribbiani, who was such a big part of why those cars were so good to drive, is now obviously at GWM, back at Lang Lang, trying to make the Utes and the SUVs that we now buy, give them some of those same flavours and some of that same capability. So, long live the VF. Yeah.
I mean, that's something I didn't touch on, was the Ute. By the end, that was Australia's sports car. The VF SSV was our version of a Camaro.
Yep.
That's why, it was classic. Payload, who gives a crap about payload? But, it's funny that we, even now, I guess, we see it with the Ranger Raptor, being people don't really, a lot of ute buyers aren't that fussed about payload. They want a performance car, and the ute became the performance car because, look, it obviously dated back before that, before VF. Like, it had been an evolving trend we'd seen with VE and even going back to VT to a degree. But, it became, again, that the sort of cultural marker for Australia was, a two-door sports car. It's got a really big open boot. Yep. That's what it was. So, anyway, that's my choice. What is your number one? I don't know if I've got a drum roll sound effect. I haven't worked out this podcasting caper just yet, but what have you got?
Well, we've already touched on it, but for me, the number one is the 48215, simply because it doesn't, like, Holden doesn't exist. And if we're talking about significant Holdens, if we're having our museum exhibit at the World of Cars,
World Car Institute.
World Car Institute. Sorry.
World Car Institute. I can't remember what I called it. World Institute of Cars. We can go either way. We haven't. We've got to see what isn't copyrighted yet.
It's so important. I mean, the Prime Minister flagged off the first one off the production line. It's pretty. It was pretty important. It was a pretty big deal. But also, the reason it's number one is that it set the blueprint for all the. We were just talking about VF, right? What was it? The Evoque at the very end still had a 6-cylinder engine in the front. It had room for 4 people. It had a big boot, and it was rear-wheel drive. Like, it's exactly the same format that was established in 1948. Like, it really did set the template, and maybe that's why you talk about the ZB not being accepted. Like, it needed to, but it strayed from the template that had been Australia's own car for 70 years.
Yeah, you could see there's a clear, linear, connection between 48215 and VF.
Yeah,
right? Like you say, there is that shared DNA that goes there. Where it wasn't. There was a break with ZB. It became something else. It became a different species, so to speak, because it was so different. But it's fascinating. I think, obviously I agree. I mean, I think 48215 without it, there is no Holden. We were saying before, it is the Holden. Without turning into sort of a political diatribe, I mean, it is such a shame that we don't make things like this anymore. Australia, it's important to remember. I think it was something like there was 13 countries in the world at the time, just over a decade ago, where you could take a blank piece of paper and finish with a mass-produced car. Yeah. We were one of them. You had these fantastic, design studios and manufacturing facilities, and I think we're both really lucky that we were able to experience that because, like you were saying, there were so many Holdens to pick up. Go into, Port Melbourne, Holden HQ was always a special experience. Yeah. It was a really cool part for me of Australian culture. That Australia, something that we as a country could have been, we were really proud of. And it's a shame that for a variety of factors, we don't do it anymore. I get it. I'm not a politician. I'm not a businessman. I get that there is a, financial reality to what was happening and those sorts of things. There's also just, there's a reality. The government, frankly, props up a lot of businesses, and I don't think there's many car industries in the world that don't have some sort of government support. And, so it's, it's a little funny now. We sit here and there's a lot of complaints about the Chinese car industry. They're subsidised too much. It's like, well, there's nothing stopping us subsidising except a will to do it. And so we as a country chose not to do it. So, I mean, I think it was, but, like that Holden, the original car, like you say, it was...
And the car was good. I mean, like you say, it was flawed, but...
Yeah.
It was really popular. The price was right. It delivered what people needed because other options were stuff coming out of probably England. So it had more space. It had way more performance. And it's funny, it wasn't a performance car, but compared to what everything around it at the time, man, it was like an SSV Redline. Like it had twice the horsepower of some of that Triumph or whatever MG stuff that your other option was. So I think Aussies, it really hit the nail on the head of what Aussies wanted. It was Australia's own car. And, we're talking about Holdens, but then suddenly Australia as a concern became viable for Ford to start making cars here. And we got all that. And then we, Valiant and Mitsubishi and Toyota and there we go. So it really did set us on our way as a country, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about V8s before, so they are culturally ingrained. But there's no doubt that for the longest time, the big Aussie 6 was it's just as big a part of, if not a bigger part, statistically than the V8, because like you say, it offered more power. Like these half-hearted little pommy cars weren't built for Australia.
Right.
Big, wide, tough Australia. And so Holden met that demand, and so that's why it worked. That's why it became popular. It's why Holden then went on and lasted for as long as it did, because it gave Australian car buyers what they wanted, and ultimately that's the main purpose a car should exist, right? It's to meet the demand of a customer, and I think right. 48215 did that. Absolutely hit the nail on the head. So yeah,
and to set up the appetite, I think the appetite's still there. Again, to take it back to what you started with, the utes. Okay, there are tax advantages and stuff in this country why people buy utes, but equally, people still want that car that can theoretically go anywhere and do anything. That's why we buy so many Land Cruisers and Patrols and utes and stuff like that, because, if someone still offered, if Kia had come out with the Tasman with a V8 in it, it would have sold.
Yeah.
Because look at the Patrol sales, still going nuts, even though it's got a massive, I wouldn't want to fuel a Patrol, but people out there do. So there's still that appetite. There's just not the locally made product anymore. So, but thank God we got to experience plenty of them while we did.
Yeah, no doubt. I feel very, very privileged to have driven so many of them and experienced them really at their peak. At the before we ended up with the sad demise. But I think it's important to remember Holden and celebrate Holden for what it is and what it was, and hopefully, obviously GM has a very different presence in Australia now. Arguably, it makes more sense, but it's just fascinating. We see it on Talk Cafe with our stories. If we write about Holden, readers still love to hear about it because it's just been such a part of our cultural DNA. All right, well, thanks for that, Scotty. I think that was really good. Not too much disagreement or matching, but that's good. So anyway, look, you're the listeners. You tell us what you think. Do you agree? Did we get it right? Do you prefer Scott's list or my list? Or are you just already swearing at us through your favourite podcast device? Are you madly writing all caps comments down the bottom telling us what a bunch of idiots we are? And either way, let us know. We want to know your top 5 Holdens, so let us know in the comments or on social media. And we hope you enjoyed the talk. So, yeah, thanks for that, Scott. Hopefully, let's do it again soon.
See you next time.